In this lecture, I'm going to talk about a basic concept in linguistics, and that is the arbitrary, the non-arbitrary nature of language. What this means when we use the word arbitrary, we could use another word, random. That is, linguists mainly argue that there is no relationship between the sign and what it refers to. In that sense, it's arbitrary. Okay, but there are some facets of language which are non-arbitrary, in which there's a close relationship between the linguistic sign and the concept that it's referring to. Okay, so we've met some of these words before, and the first word is signifier, and a signifier is the kinds of signs, linguistic signs, although in a sense we're going to reserve the word sign to mean something else. So a signifier can be a sound. Okay, so we've got in English we have the sound rose, and that refers to the particular concept of a flower. And we can also have a different, in other languages, a different sound. In German, rosa refers to the same concept, but they're different sounds. And then if you look at the written form, there's the written form rose, and contrast that with the Irish form of the written form of rose, and I'm not going to pronounce it because I can't. So what we're saying here is that there are many different signifiers which can all refer to the same real world concept of a rose. So in that sense, that's why linguists talk about the fact that the linguistic sign is kind of random. It could be anything. In that sense, it's arbitrary. We could choose anything and agree that a particular sign referred to something. And that's the nature of the arbitrary nature of language. And then the other term that we use there is signified, and so the signifier refers to what is signified. So the concept of a rose is signified. And it's a particular real-world existence of a particular phenomenon, like a rose. Okay, so that, in a sense, is an argument that linguists make about the arbitrary nature of linguistic signs. Let's look a bit more at the relationship between the signifier and the signified, and say a little bit more about what a linguistic sign is. So the signifier is not a sign unless someone recognizes it as such and relates it to a signified concept. Okay, so is a person actually referring to something? Are they coughing? Are they yawning? Are they just making any random noise? It only becomes a sign when it actually refers to something. And a very good example of this is the story of Helen Keller and her first recognition of the finger-spelt word water and the concept or experience of water. So you can see there is a system of finger spelling in the alphabet, and this was the means of communication that was used by Helen Keller's teacher when she started working with Helen when she was, 5-6 years of age. Helen Keller had lost her language abilities through illness when she was around about 18 months of age. So one thing we can say about this is that a sign is therefore neither the word itself, or the sound, or whatever it is, nor the object it refers to, but the relationship between the two. So once you understand that the signifier is actually pointing to, referring to something that's signified, then you recognize it as a sign. Okay, so Here's the very famous scene where Helen Keller and her teacher are at the water pump, and this is the first time that Helen Keller connects the signifier to the signified. So on 5th of April 1887, after a month of no progress, the now famous moment arrived when the two were down at the water pump. Anne Sullivan, that's the name of Helen Keller's teacher at the time, was spelling water into Helen's palm while letting the water run over the girl's other hand. Okay, she's trying to communicate. Okay, so she's repeating this particular signifier until Helen, at this moment, understands the connection between the signifier and what is signified, which is the water. Suddenly, Helen got it. Frantic with excitement, Helen spelled it back to Anne, W-A-T-E-R. Soon she was urging Anne to show her the names of all kinds of things, learning at least 30 new words within a few hours. When she asked for a name to call Anne, Anne spelt back teacher, and that's the name that Helen would call her by for the rest of their lives together. So this is the discovery of language, that a particular signifier refers to something signified in the real world, and so then we have knowledge of the linguistic sign. I want to talk about three meanings of a sign, and you're probably familiar with the first two. The denotative meaning, and that's the one you can look in a dictionary, and that gives you a definition of a particular word. But also there is the connotation of a particular word, and that is the kinds of ideas, feelings that are evoked by a particular word. So if I say the word Manhattan to you, you'll have pictures in your head. It'll either be positive or negative. If I say Macy's to you, you'll have a similar type of connotation. Maybe it's excitement, New York City, etc. So all words have a denotation, a particular reference, a definition, but they also are accompanied by particular cultural associations, often positive, sometimes negative. A third meaning of a sign is what is called iconic. And so you can think of icons, images, logos as being part of this iconic meaning. In terms of language, the most common iconic form that language can take is that of onomatopoeia. The word sounds like the concept it's referring to. So if you say whoops or wow, those are sounds which correspond to the emotion of surprise, wow, or something going wrong, like whoops. Other more traditional icons, of course, are things like the heart there in I love New York, etc., or DKNY, which of course is another icon. You're probably more familiar with icons as images, and these tend to be, in all cultures, culturally very prevalent. So I've just given you a few visual icons here. That's the famous painting, the Nighthawks, you find that in the Chicago Institute of Art. A famous Edward Hopper, very iconic in American culture. Of course, a picture of Che Guevara, extremely iconic, and of course Albert Einstein. So these are kind of images that inform particular societies. When we talk about iconic in terms of language, of course, we're talking about, for the most part, we're talking about the connection between the sound of a word and its particular concept. So in English, we can represent intensification in terms of sound. So I am so tired. So we elongate the particular sound there to express how much tired we are. So the longer we maintain that, so the larger we're conveying the notion of tiredness. If you contrast that with French, of course, they don't use the elongation of the vowel, they use repetition. Okay, I'm very, 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 very tired. Très, 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 très fatigué. Sound symbolism is the word we kind of use for the way that certain sounds represent certain kinds of meanings. So if you take the sound there of like in smash, and then notice how that ash sound is repeated in crash, clash, trash, splash, mash, dash. In English, that particular type of sound symbolizes, for the most part, sudden, violent movements or actions, which is true of English, but of course it's not true of other languages. It's specific to English. And you can also find connections between, say, the length of a word and what it's trying to convey. So it's interesting to think of big, which is 3 phonemes, bigger, 5 phonemes, and biggest, 7 phonemes. So there's a kind of an iconic connection between the length of the word and the size it's trying to convey. You're probably also familiar with the iconic meanings in terms of fonts. So if you look at these, you know that that first one, that comic Popeye, always conveys something like a comic, something funny. And we wouldn't expect that to be used, that font to be used in a serious newspaper. We'd expect something gothic like the New York Times. Notice how that Gothic has also moved into to express music in terms of heavy metal. So that's the notion of iconicity and the connection to language. There's a kind of a connection, and when you have that kind of connection, we're talking about more of a non-arbitrary relationship between the signifier and what is signified. For linguists, they tend to hold very dearly the notion that the relationship between signs are random or arbitrary. It could be anything. For language users, it's interesting that we tend to think there is a closer relationship. Here's a quote from Ottavio Paz. I confess that not without overcoming a deep repugnance can I accept that the relation between sound and meaning is, as Saussure, the famous linguist, and his disciples maintain, a result of an arbitrary convention. My distrust is natural. Poetry is born from the old magical belief in the identity between a word and what it denotes. Okay, so that's a very romantic view. It's a non-linguistic view of the relationship of the signifier and the signified. There's a concrete poem which is about airplanes, and it's been organized as airplanes. So in that sense, that is very iconic. A concrete poem is very iconic. And this is kind of something of the thing that Paz is trying to get at here, this romantic notion that the word itself has some kind of relationship with what it's referring to, the actual real-world concept. When there's a close relationship between a sign and the real-world concept, we can talk about it as being non-arbitrary or a motivated sign, and we can talk about the iconicity of the sign. If you look on the left there, you can see the Japanese kanji for tree, and you can begin to see how there is a close connection between the representation of the sign and the real-world concept of a tree. Again, intensification in English, the elongation of the vowel, please, mom, when you're begging somebody for something. So the elongation is iconic of how much you really want something. If you look on the right there, there's some examples of our sign language. This is British Sign Language. And so if you look at the first one, the A, there's the sign for cry. And as you can see, that's very iconic because it's very understandable to everyone that that refers to cry. And then another one, of course, is a B, which is aeroplane. And notice again how iconic that is, the sign that's being made. So those are two examples of the non-arbitrary relationship of signs. If you look at the bottom two there, C and D, these are non-iconic. They're symbolic, but there's no really real relationship between the sign in sign language, British Sign Language, battery, and then the other word there is afternoon. Okay? So the top two are very iconic, the bottom two are non-iconic. Here's another example of the motivated sign and how, in many ways, we like to think that there is a relationship between a signifier and what is signified. This is taken from Atonement, the novel. And I'm just going to read this. You may have seen the movie as well. So the word, and I'm going to not tell you what the word is that she's thinking about. You see if you can guess it. The word, she tried to prevent it sounding in her thoughts, and yet it danced through them obscenely, a typographical demon, juggling vague, insinuating anagrams. An old uncle and a nut, the Latin for next, an old English king attempting to turn back the tide. Rhyming words took their form from children's books. The smallest pig in the litter, the hounds pursuing the fox, the flat-bottomed boats on the Cam by Grantchester Meadow. So these are all clues as to what this particular word is. Okay. Naturally, she had never heard the word spoken or seen it in print or come across it in asterisks. No one in her presence had ever referred to the word's existence. And what was more, no one, not even her mother, had ever referred to the existence of that part of her to which Brioni was certain the word referred. She had no doubt that that was what it was. The context helped, but more than that. Okay, so now we get to the iconic interpretation of this word. The word was at one with its meaning and was almost onomatopoeic, the smooth, hollowed, partly enclosed form of its first three letters were as clear as a set of anatomical drawings. Three figures huddling at the foot of the cross. You guessed the word already? The word is cunt, C-U-N-T. So that's an example how, for the ordinary person, there is always an attempt to kind of connect, like Paz was saying, the actual word with what it signified. For linguists, of course, there's no relationship. Cunt is just an arbitrary signifier, and of course there are many different words for it to refer to the same concept. But for Brioni, this young teenage girl, she's so obsessed with this discovery of this word and what it refers to that it does take upon this very iconic, motivated relationship between the sign and what it refers to. So there she was talking about a visual connection. And what we do find is that in many languages, and this is usually with non-Indo-European languages, we do find that there are often relationships, visual relationships between the signifier and the signified. Think of the word in English, zigzag, which is very visually similar to the actual concept of a zig and zag. So here's a word in Siwu. and I'm not going to pronounce it. And this is an example of what we call, and this is a larger term to describe these motivated signs, these signs that have a close relationship between the form and what they're referring to, as ideophones. Okay, so you can see there the relationship between, for this word referring to snake in Siwu, and the actual concept of a snake. The other term we can use here, as well as ideophones, and these are ideophones, but it's the notion of sound symbolism, that certain sounds symbolize certain concepts. So it's interesting when you think of the word in English cock-a-doodle-doo. We know that's very onomatopoeic, and it actually refers to the sound made by this cock. It's very interesting when you look at other languages and begin to realize that the sounds that cocks make in different languages is not exactly the same. It's slightly different, which would suggest that, you know, it is slightly arbitrary. But for the most part, they're pretty similar, but they are different. And you can have a look at that list of the sound, the word cock-a-doodle-doo in all these different languages. So I talked before about the notion of an ideophone, and this is a term we can use to describe all these signs that have a close relationship between the signifier and the signified. So ideophones, and they're also called as expressives or mimetics, are words that evoke an idea in sound, often a vivid impression of certain sensations or sensory perceptions, for example, sound, movement, color, shape, or action. And what's interesting is, I mentioned, we heard mention of Saussure, the linguist, earlier. The notion of the arbitrary nature of language is very much based upon Western languages, which don't have a lot of idiophonic language. Ideophones are found more abundantly in Asian, African, and Amerindian languages, but they're really quite rare as a word class in Indo-European languages. There's an example from Japanese, and there are many, many words in Japanese which are idiophonic in this sense. Interestingly, there are some in English, and so these are a few examples of ideophones in English. Pitter patter. Notice the doubling of the sound of raindrops. Flip flop, the things you wear on your feet. Splish splash. Ta-da! Representing a fanfare. Ka-chink, the sound of money. And bubble and squeak, which is really, which is a stew, of course, a word for a specific type of stew. And the notion of bubble and squeak there is trying to convey the sound of the stew bubbling away. In Japanese, the word for a type of stew is called shabu shabu, which again is the notion, trying to capture in sound the particular concept of a stew cooking in a pot. To connect it even further with food, and you'll be reading an article on this, and this is well, there's two articles about the relationship of the sound symbolism in English of front vowels and back vowels. And I've given you some examples there of our front vowels, B, hit, hate, and then some examples of test, of course, and then some examples of back vowels, ban, food, put, home, court, dusk, cot. And if you want to get the feel for why we make this distinction between vowel sounds that seem to be made in the front of the mouth and vowel sounds in the back of the mouth, you can take the word where is it? Hey, yeah. You can say the word hate and then say the word hat. Okay, hate, hat, hate, hat. Notice something's moving. So the hate, the A sound is at the front of the mouth. If you say the word hat, okay, like as in ban, ha, it's at further back in the mouth. So that's the distinction we're making between front and back back vowels. So some interesting research that has been done, and this is the article by Girafsky about ice cream, which is also building on some previous research about the use of these, the nature of the sound symbolism of front and back vowels to do with particular brand names of food. And so what he did was looked at the words crackers, the product crackers, and ice cream. So if you're buying crackers, you want to have something which is crisp, probably light. And if you're buying ice cream, you probably want something which is thick, luscious. Okay, so what he found when he looked, he collected a series of brand names of crackers and a series of brand names of ice cream, and found that there's predominantly more front vowels used for the names of crackers, okay, and more back vowels used for the names of ice cream, and you can see the relationship there. He's building on previous research, and that suggested that our front vowels, as opposed to back vowels, are perceived as smaller, lighter, milder, thinner, softer, faster, colder, more bitter, more feminine, friendlier, weaker, lighter as opposed to heavier, and prettier. Okay, so it's a very interesting notion here that we do have an association, a sound symbolism between these front vowels and things which are light, pretty, feminine, and the back vowels which are symbolize things which are heavier. And so that is an example then of the non-arbitrary relationship of signs. For the most part, linguists argue that there is a non-arbitrary or random relationship between the signifier and the signified. But as we've seen, there are plenty of examples where it is non-arbitrary or non-random, that there is a close relationship between the signifier and the signified, and this is what we call motivated signs.